Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are very excited to share with you, this is an International Division sponsored or related panel, and this is about as international as it gets, the United Nations looking at cities and planning issues. So my name's Gregory Scruggs. I'm a planner that's been impressed into the service of the media this year while working for Cityscope, a nonprofit media outlet focused on trends in urban innovation. I know I've peppered everybody with some handouts of the kind of coverage we do, specifically of Habitat 3. We also have some out front and up here on broader trends. So we've got a story from Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia, another one from Copenhagen about kind of cutting edge and interesting things happening in those cities. And we'll be joined by 3 APA members, quite a distinguished group, including some fellows of the AICP, who have chosen to dedicate some of their professional time and attention this year to Habitat 3, and they'll tell you a little more about why they've gotten involved and what they're doing on that front. But first, since this could be a future AICP exam question, I thought we would just throw it out there. What exactly is Habitat 3? A little bit of late afternoon levity here to keep us going on Monday afternoon. Of course, we are here not for NASA or indie rock band or any trilogy movies on ant colonies, but rather the much drier United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development. So as I mentioned now, I'm working in journalism on this front and going back to grade school in the 5 W's of the who, what, where, when, and why. This is a very complicated process, and we're trying to distill it a little bit to some of the basics, so why you should be interested in it. And up to 40,000 people are potentially expected to come this year to Quito, the capital of Ecuador, for a 4-day summit hosted by the United Nations on housing and urban development, which is about as close to planning as it gets in the UN universe. And these Habitat conferences happen once every 20 years, so it's pretty much a once-in-a-generation global gathering. And if you were to go to Quito, and should you have your interest peaked today, we recommend you definitely get on it as far as hotels and flights. That will be a hot commodity down there. You can expect to meet people from all over the world working in every aspect of housing and urban development, fellow planners, architects, urbanists, activists, grassroots organizations, NGOs, national governments, local governments. It's going to be quite the scene, quite the show. And in fact, dialing it back 40 years to 1976, this is Habitat 3, of course, there had to be a 1 and a 2. The first such conference took place in Vancouver. I've been doing a little bit of research on that for Cityscope, and it was actually described to me by someone who attended as the Woodstock for urbanists. Back in the heady days of the 1970s, when ideas like John Turner on self-built housing and a lot of idealism were percolating in the air, in Vancouver, the city that had given birth to Greenpeace and some of the kind of radical progressive activism on environmental issues and the idea of human settlements and where human beings and sort of the human environment fits into the same decade that gave us Earth Day, was part of what made the Vancouver conference such a show. And in the UN world, it was unique because it was the first time that there was an opportunity for civil society, that very broad category of everybody who doesn't represent a government, to have their say. So this is a scene from Jericho Beach in Vancouver, where there was a Habitat Forum, as it was called, that took place in parallel to the official UN pomp and circumstance of heads of state. And folks like Margaret Mead and R. Buckminster Fuller, Mother Teresa were on hand giving speeches and demonstrations and lectures for this, again, kind of first moment where the world came together to really think about where humans live and what that should look like. The U.S. was represented. The message from then President Gerald Ford was given by the HUD secretary at the time. This is actually a legit pop quiz question. Does anybody know who was the HUD secretary in June of 1976? Anybody? Carla Hill. Carla Hill, okay. And in fact, a young Justin Trudeau, now the prime minister, was on hand as his father was the official head of the delegation for Canada, the host country. So 1976, Habitat 1 gave birth to UN Habitat, the United Nations Human Settlements Program, which in the UN family is tasked with essentially implementing through advocacy efforts, policy recommendations, technical support, policies and programs on human settlements, which translates in many respects to cities and kind of the issues that planners deal with around the built environment. 20 years later, and I admit I still have not figured out why these conferences operate on a 20-year cycle. 20 years later, everybody came together in Istanbul for Habitat 2, which resulted in something called the Istanbul Declaration and the Habitat Agenda that looked at issues like slums, or what we would now call informal settlements, the needs of vulnerable groups like women and youth, in general, the needs of the urban poor and those in developing world cities. And this created a new mandate that's guided UN Habitat's work over the last 20 years. So if you followed anything that Habitat is up to as an agency, pretty much all of it comes out of the 80-odd pages in the Habitat Agenda. On the bold-faced names, the celebrity spotting blotter, I was told that Jane Fonda and Fidel Castro both came to Istanbul. And Castro in particular had a pretty fiery speech about the state of the world cities and what we could learn from the Cuban experience. And so flashing forward 20 years, we find ourselves now poised for Quito and what will be called the new urban agenda. And I'm putting my emphasis on the second word because it is a marked rhetorical shift from how the UN has been addressing the broad concept of human settlements. And that shift has been led in large part by the gentleman at the top there, Dr. Juan Clos, the former mayor of Barcelona, who is the executive director of UN Habitat. So he's been in charge of the agency for the last, 8 or so years. And that also makes him the Secretary General of Habitat 3. So he is the figure at the top of this process, the man who we like to joke must have body doubles because he is everywhere all the time on the road to Habitat 3 with these meetings and conferences happening in the run-up to Quito. And it's very much, he has a particular vision that he's pushing for the new urban agenda for Habitat 3 that tries to shift a little bit how the UN and the development community, and when I say development, I don't mean in the real estate sense, but in the poverty alleviation sense, the Millennium Development Goals that the UN promoted back in 2000 that you might be familiar with, or more recently the Sustainable Development Goals, that cities are not an obstacle to development, but a solution. That traditionally cities have been thought of as these, again, within this development framework, as places that are causing problems, causing pollution, causing slum-like conditions, causing low life expectancies and high rates of disease. And Clos's argument that we're seeing in the run-up to Habitat 3, and what I think is an exciting opportunity for planners, is the argument that cities are in fact the solution, and they just need to be given the permission, the rights, the responsibilities by national governments to take charge of their own affairs. As he likes to say, cities are factories that generate money. They can actually finance through the creation of urban land, through collecting of property taxes, through the generation of value that comes with land and urbanization. They can actually generate the money necessary to finance the development needs that would improve quality of life for their citizens. So how do we get to that argument then getting accepted at the UN level? It is a very complicated process, and even as someone working on this full-time, I still wake up some mornings trying to wrap my head around it. But for this panel, we will get a broader overview of that from Eugenie Burch, but also focusing on a few key aspects that relate to the folks here at this table. So the first bit would be national committees. Every country is expected to draft some experts in the field of housing and urban development to serve on an advisory committee to the national government that will in turn help prepare a national report that would be a look back at the last 20 years since Habitat 2 on the state of urbanization in that country. The US is no exception, and we have Jeff Sohl, who serves on the US National Committee. Habitat 3 has also generated a tremendous amount of research, the substance, the ideas of the future of urbanization. That has taken form in 22 issue papers drafted by different UN agencies. So UNICEF writing about children and youth in cities, or UNEP, the environmental program, writing about ecology. And those internal UN research documents have been coupled with an external expert set of opinions from 200 policy experts from around the world, serving on 10 different policy units that are taking these specific themes that we'll likely see in the new urban agenda. So topics like housing policy, resilience, urban economic development, the right to the city. And we have Tom D'Alessio from Next City, who is serving on one of those policy units. And lastly, as I mentioned, in 1976, it was a breakthrough for the UN to actually have a space for civil society to gather and have its voice be heard. And that process has evolved considerably in the last 40 years and has coalesced under the umbrella of something called the General Assembly of Partners that Eugenie Birch is the president of and has much more to share with you. And finally, I put in brackets because it's not represented by the panel, but would certainly be of interest to anyone who works for a municipal government, is how, in fact, local governments are getting engaged ahead of Habitat 3. As I mentioned, one of the high-level messages, one of the key takeaways from the conference will hopefully be that national governments should allow their local governments, their cities, to take on more rights and responsibilities to manage their own affairs and promote quality human settlements. So ahead of that, to make that case, something called the World Assembly of Local Authorities will be taking place on the eve of Habitat 3. This is kind of like a parallel. This is like the local government engagement parallel to what civil society is up to. We will have some links at the end where you can go for more information. But if you represent a local government, you want to get involved in Habitat 3, that might be the place for you. So with that, I will turn things over to our panel. And I think we'll be going in, I guess, some kind of reverse or mixed up order from what's on the screen, and we'll be starting with Eugenie Birch. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Greg. I've also been on the policy units and the national committee, so I certainly have an overview of what's happening along with everybody. No, I just wanted to say that there's a lot of participation in this room as well. I see Lincoln Land, which was a co-chair of one of the policy units. But let me give you some background here on basically what this global consensus will be as it evolves. And the big question is, what is going to be in the new urban agenda? Greg showed you some wonderful slides about the citizen participation in Vancouver and in Istanbul. And more recently, we've had a number of global policy decisions that have occurred that have been extremely important from the point of view of cities. The first one being the passage this September of the Sustainable Development Goals, for which an enormous fight was made to get one on cities, the famous Goal 11. Goal 11 is basically focused on planning, and it's calling for housing, it's calling for transportation, it's calling for lessening the environmental impact of cities, it's talking about building resilient cities and so forth. This is going to be one of the foundational efforts that will provide a basis for the new urban agenda. Also, of course, you probably watched in December the Paris Agreement. That's going to be signed actually in April, in a couple of weeks. The heads of states are coming to New York City to sign their agreement to cut emissions. And we know that basically cities are going to play a very, very important role in that. And in fact, the Compact of Mayors, where several hundred mayors showed up in Paris, really pushed that to a new level in terms of appreciation of the role of cities. But remember, all of these agreements are basically agreed upon by the members, by the nations, and there is some tension between the nations and local government, which we'll get into a minute. But basically, Habitat 3 is going to be experiencing some of this tension and hopefully moving carefully through that tension in a way that's very productive. Now, Greg gave you a number of items that occurred for the preparations for Habitat 3. Preparations started more than 4 years ago. They started officially with the General Assembly passing a resolution saying there will be a conference called the Conference on Cities and Housing and Sustainable Development. And that triggered the creation of the Secretariat, triggered the assignment of 10 member states into something called a bureau, whose job is to be the executive committee for the 193 member states that will participate in this, and they set the course. The Secretariat and the bureau decide exactly what's going to happen. Now, unlike the other habitats that we talked about before, this habitat has a tremendous amount of preparatory and complex preparatory set of organization, as you can see from this chart. As Greg mentioned, every nation was invited to send in a national report that looked backwards and forwards about what their aspirations are for Habitat 3. The UN regions will be writing regional reports, and there'll be a global report that will be coming out this spring. There are also something called the regional and thematic conferences and policy units. It's very important to remember these. I'm going to tell you why in a minute, but just keep those in mind. Some nations have had national urban forums to think about what they want to do in Habitat 3. In terms of citizen participation and involvement, there have been two initiatives of the World Urban Campaign, which is the partnership organization of UN Habitat, to support and move towards more meaningful participation in Habitat 3. One has been the creation of something called the Urban Thinkers Campuses, of which 26 were held around the world, 2 in the United States, 1 in New York and 1 in Omaha, working on a document called The City We Need, which is basically an aspirational document talking about the prescription for what kind of cities we'd like. And this is a prescription that you'd all agree with, a well-planned city, a connected city, a compact city, a just city, and so forth. They've just issued that City We Need statement. And secondly, the General Assembly of Partners, which is a revolutionary idea to bring together all the groups that the UN recognizes. You have to realize, as Greg said, learning about this is like getting another PhD because it's extremely complex. But basically, the United Nations, since 1992, recognized what they called 9 major groups. And that came out of the climate deliberations. These were groups of civil society that were going to be necessary for climate, and ever since, for improvements in climate. And ever since the United Nations, okay, we recognize these 9 groups. They can be accredited by the United Nations. They can speak on the United Nations floor and so forth. But Habitat, when it had Habitat 2, also recognized something called the Habitat 2, Habitat Agenda Partners, which were groups that also had relevance to cities and human settlements. And so the General Assembly of Partners is made up of 15 partner groups, which encompass the 9 major groups, which are women, local government, trade unions, business, and so forth, and 5 more that are Habitat Agenda relevant, grassroots organizations, foundations and philanthropy, media, and others. So there are 15 of these who are meeting regularly, come up with a consensus statement to have as an input into the new urban agenda. Then every conference has something called preparatory conferences, where all the modalities for what's going to happen in the conference are worked out. Interestingly enough, in the last PrepCom, the decision as to how to deal with local governments could not be worked out. The last one was in Nairobi, mainly because Argentina tapped its pretty little feet and said, we don't want local government there. Why do you think Argentina would have had that idea? Anybody know? Maybe. Even more important. The Falklands, absolutely. They did not want the mayor of Falklands showing up and saying something nasty about the president of Argentina. Nonetheless, fast forward in December, this was all sent to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly came up with what is called the modalities for the new urban agenda. And these modalities are going to be the inputs that will go into, the official inputs, the words into the actual document itself. So as we look at this graphic, you can see there are some basic things that were developed in the 1940s, UN values, human rights, and so forth. Those will be announced. There are foundational efforts, which were previous conference. This is almost like how we write our law. You always refer back to they call it agreed upon language that have been developed through other activities. So we had the Sendai conference, which was on resilience. We had financing for development, which is in Addis Ababa, and we had the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. These will be foundational for the new urban agenda. But what's really important is the official inputs, which are these policy unit papers, which Tom will talk about, and the regional and thematic conferences declarations, which are going on right now. All of this is being fed into the Secretariat, who's doing working notes, sending it on to the Bureau, who's going to write the zero draft, and along the way, the 193 member states have to agree on this whole thing. And then over on the side, even though we do have civic engagement, civil society involved in this, you have to remember this is a member state, a national kind of activity. So we're there sort of trying to push our way in, and we know that our meetings are not going to be 20 miles away as they were in Vancouver, or even 5 miles away as they were in Istanbul, going to be on the same site as where the member state meetings are. So there'll be much more opportunities for intersection with them. The official inputs, as you heard from Greg, but just here's how they were organized. There are 6 big areas that are thought should be very important to the New Urban Agenda, and they're written, as were mentioned, and then there were the policy units were developed according to these squares on the bottom that you can see. And the policy unit papers are now online to be read, as are the issue papers. So if anybody wants to see what people had to say about these whole things, you can do that. Plus, there are regional and thematic meetings that are happening. These are coded blue and red. Red for meetings that are sponsored by member states, which have a little more weight because they're member state meetings, and these are regional meetings, and meetings that are sponsored by cities, and those are the blue ones, and they are dealing with the various topics that are imagined will go into the New Urban Agenda. And as you can see right now, as we speak, there's one happening in Barcelona on public spaces, which is a very important topic. There'll be a couple days later one on informal settlements, and the last one on Latin America and the Caribbean regional area. All of these issue declarations about what they think should be going into, statements should be going into the New Urban Agenda. Now we're beginning to see a convergence on various inputs it's a slow convergence, but basically the theme that's coming out is reap the benefits of urbanization for all, at the same time address issues of poverty. Have the form and configuration of cities and regions is going to be very, very important at this. This is going to be a document that's going to push planning, believe me. And this is very unusual from the point of view of the very strong feeling of leadership and others, how important it is to push planning at all levels, from a national policy plan all the way down to the local level. Thinking about healthy, safe, and resilient places. Governance. The key word here is subsidiarity, finding the level of government that does the thing best. You wouldn't want the national government collecting garbage. At the same time, the local government can't set up a universal health care program. So sorting all that out is going to be very, very important. Participation is envisioned, a human rights approach, and the implementation is going to be talked about a good deal, and the focus is on spatial mechanisms, legal frameworks, and financing mechanisms to make sure we get the cities we want and need. Knowledge and monitoring will also be important. So the New Urban Agenda, what do we think is going to be in it? This is kind of what we think. This is the anticipated document. The aspiration is that it will be short and focused. It's not going to be everything the kitchen sink, they hope. That's the aspiration, but remember there are 193 member states. And that belief that there will be a number of commitments that will be made by member states along with partners from all sectors to think about how to implement this. The qualities are, number one, it will have universal application, but have room, of course, for local interpretation, and we'll hear about that in a minute. It's at national governments. Remember, it's a member state document, but it have to be translated locally. It's hoped for it will be transformative. It'll be people-centered but spatially integrated, and there'll be some measurable pieces to it. The 3 themes that you can see are in terms of substantive contents, all are going to have physical, spatial planning ramifications within them. Good housing, making sure people aren't living on vulnerable properties, making sure that you have the infrastructure in a city that allows people to get to their jobs. I'm simplifying this, but these are the kinds of things that are anticipated. The Implementation Act will be, hopefully, a real good definition about accountability, how to set up ways of being accountable. A lot of discussion about planning and managing spatial development, and of course, financing. What's going to happen between now and October when the meeting happens? Integrated into the modalities that were passed in December was a new process, which is pretty exciting as well. And these are consultations that are going to be occurring starting at the end of this month. The policy units and the regional thematic declarations, the authors of those will be working with the member states to talk about what their priorities were. The series of meetings with the member states and groups, one for subnational and local governments in May, from the 16th to the 18th, where there'll be testimony and interaction among them. Remember, the New Urban Agenda draft will be out, so those groups will be looking at that draft and looking for what's in it or what's not in it, and lobbying for getting things in it. Then the stakeholders will do the same thing in June. Then the member states will talk to each other in the end of June, beginning of July. Then there'll be PrepCon 3, at which point the hope-for outcome is that there'll be a pretty permanent document at that time, so that by the time people get to Quito, the emphasis can be put on the commitments and the implementation of this. Now, what is this document? It's a global consensus about what's right or what should be right about cities that has to be interpreted locally. And it's this local interpretation that's going to be very important. So as Greg mentioned, there's a national committee. The national committee right now is sponsoring 5 regional meetings. They're taking the ideas that will likely be in the New Urban Agenda, as matching them to our ideas of what we think we ought to be doing. These are being sponsored by HUD. And going out to 5 cities, 5 places. The first one was held in Chicago. It was a roaring success last week with several hundred people attending, talking about key issues, mobility for all, housing issues, and resilience. Those are the 3 themes that our government is really going to focus on as they might be implemented in Chicago. There'll be another one on May 17th in Philadelphia, another one in Miami, another one in Denver, and another one in El Paso. So if you're from any of these areas, you certainly can attend these meetings and get engaged. You can also get engaged by watching what the National Committee is doing and contacting the National Committee to lobby your member states. If you're not from the United States, find out what your national is and who's doing what. And lastly, we welcome anyone to join the General Assembly of Partners. We, at this point, are creating our consensus document, which will be given to the Secretary General, passed on to the Bureau well before the Zero document is written. And we're arguing that there are 4 areas in which we should be engaged in partnership: the area of knowledge, the area of advocacy, the area of test bedding, piloting, the area of monitoring. So we welcome you to join us, and I'll turn now over to the next speaker.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to put so there was a flurry of dates there at the end. I actually have an informational slide that I will leave up for folks to copy down some of that information while we turn things over to Tom DeLessio from Next City for our next presentation.
Thank you, Greg. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Tom DeLessio. I'm the president, CEO, and publisher of Next City. We're a nonprofit organization with a mission to inspire social, economic, and environmental change in cities through journalism and events. And we publish daily and weekly online posts. We also have opportunities for engagement in various events. We run a program called Vanguard for urban leaders under 40. And if anyone has any questions or would like further information about that, I encourage you to go to our website, nextcity.org. And you can find out more about Vanguard as well as our publications. It's very timely to be on today's panel. We actually have a post today on good, successful urbanization takes time. And so it's probably the understatement of the year. But all of you who need, obviously, an opportunity to be engaged in this discussion recognize that as planners, things take time, right? Urbanization takes time. What's most fascinating, and you'll see some of the statistics as we go through, is that by 2050, it's estimated that 4 out of 5 people around the world will live in cities and towns. It's a fundamental shift. Among demographers and social science experts, it's believed to be the first time that the world will be that urbanized a place as we're moving forward. And so the question is, how do we move forward in all of this? My engagement in this is as a professional planner, as a policy expert, and now as the president of Next City, covering these events and trying to inspire change as we go through. We've been covering Habitat 3 for a number of years, and we were also part of the World Urban Forum 7 in Medellin, Colombia. We had a platform there where we allowed and encouraged folks to actually have conversations on that. That was my introduction, actually, to Next City. I spoke on that platform, and I was thrilled to see afterwards a lot of the posts that came out of that. Next City posts job descriptions at the bottom of the website. They actually posted the head of the position for Next City I saw that and I said, well, what the heck, I'll try and apply. And I was thrilled that two of our board members are here, Jeannie Birch and Eric Shaw, and they saw fit to hire me, and the rest is history. But what I bring to the table that is perhaps unique is a planner's perspective, and someone actually who has written policy and has helped elected and appointed officials move policy. I'm also a former elected official, and so I have a sense of what mayors and council members and committee members, et cetera, go through as we go through this. So Next City is interested in actually inspiring this change through our journalism and through various events. We have co-hosted one of the Urban Thinkers campuses. We actually are also going to be in both Surabaya Com3 and in Quito for Habitat 3. With the generous funding from the Ford Foundation as well as the MacArthur Foundation, we'll have a platform in both of those locations, and we'll have the world stage in Quito, where we will have the preeminent place for people to present information and to share ideas in Quito for free. We've actually also put out a request for proposals and qualifications, and go on our website, you'll find out about this. We've actually asked 6 artists from around the world, from 6 of the fastest growing cities, to present their artwork in either Surabaya or in Quito, and to be able to discuss what urbanization means to them. So we're looking forward to the different forms of art being able to communicate urbanization and to encourage folks to be part of that. So if you're in Surabaya or Quito, make sure you come to our platform. If not, we will have information on our website at nextcity.org. I'll get into the heart of the matter. The conversation is that I was actually asked to be part of one of the 10 policy units, and that process was fascinating. The UN Secretariat asked a number of us, actually did an open invitation for folks to ask if you would be interested in serving as one of the 10 policy experts. And member states nominated, that's right. And so, and Jeannie Birch is a member of one of those policy units, and I actually applied, and we had to be approved by the United States government, by HUD, and by the Department of State. And I sort of looked at the list of the folks who were selected and said, really, me? And so, kind of fun. So I was asked to serve on the National Urban Policy Unit. And what was most interesting about that is that of the 10 policy units, our unit basically covered all of the topics. And it was sort of an overarching concept. We developed through a series of 3 meetings in Paris and London about how to actually go about national urban policies. And the report, as Greg has said, is actually available online. Go to UN Habitat, you can actually click and see the policy unit reports. But I'll just read the first paragraph because I think that'll give you a pretty good sense of what we were all about. A national urban policy is both a process and an outcome that harnesses the dynamism of cities and urbanization. Urbanization presents unprecedented opportunities, but also substantial challenges. Governments and other stakeholders must be well prepared and have frameworks for urban development in place. A national urban policy complements and reinforces rather than replicates local urban policies. It also helps align national activities with global priorities. A national urban policy sets out principles from which urban policy interventions are formulated and implementation is conceived. Results on a clear strategy and effective coordination between policies that affect national territorial concerns across the urban-rural continuum, metropolitan, regional, and supranational scales. So in developing this, as you may have just gathered through this, there's a language that you have to develop. Make sure that you communicate the key ideas here in ways that folks will be able to agree. One of the interesting discussions, and we had actually 20 experts from around the world sit on this policy unit, discuss what does it mean to be urban, what should national mean, how do we actually deal with the issue of policy going through this. So here I am, the American from USA, on this policy unit, and I'm thinking, we don't have a national urban policy going forward. And what I say to my students, I teach at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, I teach land use and infrastructure planning to architects and engineers, and I say to them, it's really kind of amazing. We're all stockholders in this corporation called America, since we're taxpayers, we hold value in that. What corporation would we own stock in a private corporation that does not have a strategic plan? It's almost criminal when you think about it. It borders on political malpractice. But we don't have a national urban policy, let alone an infrastructure plan. And obviously we see that the cataclysmic effects of not having that as we're going through. So I bring to the table the conversation saying I acknowledge the USA doesn't have a national urban policy. But we have policies, we have processes, each of us are engaged in activities and opportunities. And that's critically important. I'd like to fast forward, if you will, to the recommendations, because I think that'll give you a pretty good sense of where we're moving forward on this. And we came up with 10 recommendations that we think will help inform the new urban agenda. Now, what was most fascinating to me on this whole idea of creating a new urban agenda was that Dr. Close has a clear idea of what he wants to get out of this. And it's not just an agenda, but it's also implementation beyond. And what was most fascinating to me is we had a private dinner with him 2 years ago, and here is this radiologist, former mayor of Barcelona, starting to talk about the Athens Charter. Okay, who knows what the Athens Charter is? Well, most planners do not. It's a text, manuscript as you're going through. So for the planners and others in the audience, the Charter of Athens was developed in the 1920s by Le Corbusier and other architects who sailed around the Greek islands and came up with a prescript, if you will, of development for the future. And a lot of the development that we've seen over the last 80 years, 90 years, has followed from that. But when you start thinking about it, and the suburbanization of America and other places, you start thinking that model does not work anymore. And so Dr. Close came up with the brilliant idea of let's come up with a new Charter of Athens. And so this new urban agenda will serve as, an inspiration for what a new charter could be. So the National Urban Policies Unit started thinking, what can we recommend to help do this? Well, first, our recommendation was international agreements. We need to make sure that we build upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Paris Agreement of COP21. And for those of us that were in Paris and saw that monumental activity, let alone the agreement, I will tell you honestly, I've never been more proud of America than when I was in Paris and seeing Secretary Kerry and others negotiate that. I think fundamentally that forms the foundation for a new urban agenda. Sendai framework, which Jeannie mentioned, and then of course Agenda 2030 and the global goals as we move forward. So recommendation number 2 talked about the issue of institutional form, and that we need to create channels of participation and take into account the need to affect high-level change. Everything from legal reform to allocation of generation of information, etc. Number 3, leadership. Goes without saying, but obviously both formal and informal political leadership moving forward. Number 4, inclusive and equitable policies. We need to make sure that stakeholders are all engaged in the process. Number 5, sustainable resilience. Those are the key words that a number of us have found to be critical for our planning activities. A new urban agenda makes sure that that's at the core. Number 6, there are a couple of priority issues that have to be addressed. We need to make sure it's people-centered and that addresses critical areas of infrastructure, energy, health, education, housing, social and economic inclusion policies, and a number of other key ideas. Number 7, all of this needs to obviously be pulled together under some form of coordination. It should consider territorial concerns and the urban-rural continuum, as well as metropolitan and supranational urbanization dynamics. Number 8, capacity. We need to be effective. We need to make sure we address institutional issues, budget, training, making sure that there are planners, policy experts, and others that actually can help implement this. Number 9, communications, making sure we move forward, that we communicate this effectively, we be as transparent as possible, and that we engage all of you in the process. And last but not least, data. We need to make sure that the metrics that we identify and we start tracking are critical, they're relevant, and that they actually can produce results. We need to make sure that all of you are engaged in that conversation. You need to start thinking about what are the metrics to actually move this agenda as we go forward. And so in conclusion in all of this, it's been really fascinating to see, both as a policy expert and a planner, but also as someone who's covering these issues through journalism and events, that we're at a unique time in the world. And as I say, it's fascinating to be in a place where it's really cool, that cities are cool, and that everything's moving in that direction. We need to find ways to capture that wave, and that when we get together, not just in Quito, but also in Kuala Lumpur for World Urban Forum 9, that we actually start seeing implementation of this. And all of you need to move that forward. You need to communicate to your government and to leaders that this matters, that in fact the U.S. needs to take a prominent role in the effort, and that frankly we need a new urban policy, and we need national policies to move us forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. And to narrow our filter here to the APA itself, we have Jeff Soul, Director of International Programs, who will be speaking about his experience with APA's engagement toward Habitat 3.
Great, thanks, Greg. Nice to be here. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. APA's efforts in this have been, as Jeannie indicated, quite a lot of moving parts, shall we say. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those and try to save enough time so that we can have a yeasty discussion with all of you at the end. Just to set this in context, okay, Asia alone is going to add 800 million new urban residents in the next 15 years. That's building one San Francisco a week years. So that just tells you the opportunity. I've always characterized our involvement in Habitat 3 as, if the outcomes are, as Jeannie said, it's full employment for planners globally. Also, I want to emphasize that it's not just the physicality of a place that we're talking, also about the intangible aspects. And unlike the Athens Charter, which caused a lot of trouble all the way up through the 80s in many cases, it wasn't this world is not a one-size-fits-all kind of a place. And so we're looking very much at the integration of culture from an arts standpoint, from food, climate, all the things that go into making a city, not just the physicality of it. So the policy that APA adopts over the years through our policy and legislative processes, we have policies on climate change, sustainability, water, a whole host of things. And so those have informed our discussions as we have tried to get the information out to you as members. Greg put up earlier our website, which is called Road to Habitat 3, and I'm happy that to this day, if you type to Habitat 3, the APA site is the first thing that comes up. So if you don't see anything in this presentation that speaks to you, you can go on the website and bore down more on it. We have participated in all the things that we've talked about, the World Urban Campaign that Jeannie also chairs. That's been moving along since, 2009, right before Rio Plus 20. We're also on the National Committee, as was mentioned, and I'm happy to say that the HUD and State Department representatives have been pretty good about attending these regional efforts around the world, and I think that our committee, however, is handicapped a bit because there's some kind of an election going on, I think, in November, just after Quito, so that might compromise the attendance from the national in terms of government officials. This is a happy coincidence for us at APA because we've started something a few years ago called Sustaining Places, Best Practices for Comprehensive Plans, ably led by our research director, David Rouse, and David Gottschalk of UNC. They have come up with ways to integrate all the different components of sustainability into what we consider to be the comprehensive plan of the 21st century. So these are just sort of an outline of what you will find more in detail through our PAS reports and so on, dealing with sustaining places. But there's a definite parallel, as you've heard, of the topics that the policy units have come up with, and also what the General Assembly of Partners, all those folks, APA and its 2,000 NGO friends from around the world have come up with a kind of an approach. So there is this coalescence around the idea of what it takes to make a sustainable place. And I think that one of the things that's really critical is this issue of participation. And if we don't come out of Quito with a really strong endorsement of the value of all of the local communities, the stakeholders, participating actively, not just in shaping the policies, but in the implementation, I think that will be a real failure. But I suspect, given the engagement that we've had, that won't happen. So here are some of the ways that APA has participated, in addition to putting out information through our website, National Committee, the World Urban Campaign, and the GAP. We're looking now to find ways for you and others to suggest what topics we might focus on in the lead up, so that when we participate in Quito, we'll have the input of our members in terms of the professionals that might be on panels or side events at Quito, and also how we're going to partner. We have partners around the world who we're going to reach out to. We already have reached out to friends in the Global Planners Network, for instance, to join with us in Quito to provide space where we can hopefully have discussions and focus on APA and their partners in terms of shaping the new urban agenda, which will be the outcome document. So we've had the urban thinker campuses that JD's mentioned. We had thousands of people participating, 142 countries and so on, and 2 in the United States. And one of the things that we have tried to focus on, getting away from, I hate to beat up on Corbusier, but he's dead, so I can't, the settlement pattern is really what matters when we're talking about urbanization. And this is something that is often lost on the electeds. Hopefully they're making progress on this in terms of getting the idea that it's not just the individual. You can have a green building, but if it's in the wrong location and it's not supported by infrastructure and it's not supported by transit and so on, it's not really contributing. Okay, so you have to think beyond the building to the actual settlement pattern. And we can see over time, a lot of cities have built skylines that look modern or impressive, but the real activity is at the ground level. So building places that are good for people really is at the core of it. And I think APA and APA's members have had a lot of experience in building people-oriented places. So we're hoping to bring that experience to Habitat 3. The last thing I'll mention, one of our partners, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, working with UNESCO. UNESCO actually had not drafted an urban policy in over 30 years, but in 2011, it adopted the historic urban landscape approach to planning. And this is one of the things that, if you've been to conferences, there have been sessions about how planners can integrate this idea of settlement pattern, intangible cultural heritage into the planning process and into creating settlements, not the ones that are already there, but those thousands of San Franciscos that we're going to be building in the next 15 years. So our message is not that preservation of these traditional settlement patterns is unimportant. It is, but the lessons from those places are critical to building the kind of places that we want to build that are going to be sustainable in the future. So I'm going to talk at the end here. I want to get some discussion going. We're going to lead right into discussion, hopefully, that how can we emphasize topics like public participation? What other things should we be looking at besides resilience? Looking at governance, looking at sustainable comprehensive planning, climate action plans. These are some ideas that we have kicked around internally, but we're hoping that the discussion that we have this afternoon with you and with other members as they get involved in this will come to us with ideas about what we should be taking forward to Habitat 3. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Greg for some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. going to put up my info slide one more time just for that handy reference. And I recognize, and if you think planning jargon is bad, United Nations definitely can give the planning profession a run for its money. So I fully recognize this was some information overload over the last hour. We have a microphone here, and I would encourage those of you with questions, and they can be as basic as, wait, what do I learn at an Urban Thinkers campus? Or, is Trump somehow involved in a conspiracy against the World Urban Campaign? Please, and they can be as high level as you want as far as the themes and the substance of Habitat 3, but we do invite your questions, and you've got a crack team of experts here that will do their best to answer them. So while I let you germinate on what you might want to ask us, a few points that I do want to add. This is the new urban agenda, and when the words agenda and United Nations are in the same sentence, I know some planners get worried because of a little something called Agenda 21 that you may have heard about. And it is true that in certain circles in the US, the UN makes plans and comes up with ideas, people get concerned. So this is also a bit of a PSA that you may find something called the New Urban Agenda coming up at your local planning board meeting as the latest and greatest conspiracy of the world government at the UN. And we're here to assure you that, indeed, the UN is not nearly as powerful of a might like to be. This is not a treaty. This is not a legally binding document. If, indeed, it gets passed or a consensus is reached, yes, the U.S. will have been one of those 193 parties that agreed to it, but it is an agenda. It is a strategy document, a set of guidelines. Whether or not these actually happen in any corners of the world, not something that you need to be worried is somehow written into law and will be trumping the U.S. Constitution, no pun intended. So that is one small tidbit, and I see somebody creeping in the back of the room, and I would encourage you to come forward and just ask away.
Hi, thanks so much to the panel and for the audience. I'm looking forward to the questions that we have that we can discuss here. My name is George Benson. I'm a representative on the Student Representatives Council for APA, and I know Jeff and I have already chatted briefly about this already. But in addition to sitting on the APA there, I'm also from Canada, and I've been in discussions with CIP, our national planning organization, about this as well. And I'm really excited about the possibility of the Global Planners Network coming together and having some really clear ideas about what our priorities are as planners in this process. So I'm curious if any or all of you can speak to what the uptake has been in that network around that conversation, just because I have my own ideas about what enthusiasm levels are and so on. And two, as a student, I'm really eager to see as much student participation in those events as we can get. I've been a student participant in UN events in the past, and I can speak to just what a fabulous experience they are. So I'm just curious if you've had any thoughts about how that might look and any general ideas. Thank you everyone for that.
Well, I'd actually ask some of our partners who are actually in the room here today from RTPI, and is Brendan here? Maybe not. Brendan from PIA? No. To maybe say a few words about the conversation. Jim, would you like to mention something about the meeting that we have been having with our Global Planners Network to reinforce some of the issues? Trudy?
Please, yeah, come right up.
Trudy Elliott, the CEO of the Royal Town Planning Institute.
Hello, pleased to be here. We've been having conversations within the Global Planners Network, but also within other networks, other umbrella networks of planners. So for those of you who don't know, in Europe we have an organization called ECTPCU, which is the umbrella organization of all the European institutes of planning. There's a similar one called the Commonwealth Association of Planning, which is the global network of all the planning organizations in the Commonwealth. RTPI is active in both of those, so I can tell you about their collective view. And both those networks are working within the Global Planners Network with APA, with RTPI and others to try and come up with what we're actually going to do when we get to Quito, as well as we've all been active in the World Urban Campaign and contributed through the urban campuses, etc., to a fantastic document that's come out of the World Urban Campaign. And we salute you, Jeannie, for getting us getting us to that.
Everybody did it.
I know, but, you know, the fact that we've done it is fantastic, and we're really happy with that document. So what we're talking about now is, do we have a booth? Answer, yes. Do we put proposals in for plenary sessions, for side events? It's a bit of a challenge at the moment because there isn't an open call, so we're going to get a very short notice before we do anything. So what we're doing at the moment is preparing what if they invite us to do X, what if they invite us to do Y, and gathering together both the money, the resources, the people that will be there, and what our offers are in terms of side work. I'm slightly jealous about how the US government has engaged with partners on this, because that has not been our experience in the UK.
Jim John, Executive Director for APA. I'll just add a bit to that, and Jeff, allow you to pick up even further. There have been a series of conversations throughout APA, including the Board of Directors, with the International Division, with Tim Van Emp, who is here, including as recently as the last few hours, where we sat in one of these other rooms and had this discussion. There's probably a number of concentric circles of potential partners that will be actualized, and opportunities for you and others to be able to participate in the ways that Jeannie and Jeff have described. So I'll just touch on a couple of examples. Jeff, being a member of the delegation in the National Committee, we will have other APA representatives be part of that delegation. Included in the partners we have already had conversations with are other American-related organizations, such as the Landscape Architects, just as one. You heard from RTPI. We will be having similar conversations with equivalents around the world of APA, such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. In terms of members, there are a number of outreaches that Jeff here will be coordinating for us out to membership as a whole, including opportunities to participate physically in Quito, whether it's a booth, side events, presentations, other kinds of cooperation with our partners, but also virtually, leading up to Jeff's slides of what are the topics, who are the speakers, what are our advocacy positions on topics that we want to bring, or topics that are being brought that we want to react to. So it doesn't matter how young you are or how new to this you are. We are looking for your voice to participate. And again, Jeff is the primary contact for that. Thanks, Jeff.
Sure. Jeannie?
Actually, there are a lot of things that are happening. Of course, you can be a member, anybody, individual or organization, of the General Assembly of Partners. You get behind this screen. I'll stand up. How's that? Okay. And just go to the Habitat 3 website, and you can register, and you self-identify whether you want to be a professional, or whether you want to be a youth or child, or whether you want to be a woman or a grassroots organizer or whatever. You can self-identify. And these groups are very, very well organized and are putting forth positions. At the actual, there are two sort of events. The PrepCon 3 in Surabaya will have a lot of side events, and if people want to attend that and have side events, that is certainly going to be very, very possible. And then in Quito itself, there will be a week-long stakeholder conference. It's going to start about the 15th of October and extend towards finish at the 22nd. And so there is going to be more space to be involved than you can imagine. So there'll be lots and lots of opportunities to have side events and so forth. There will be an exhibition space, and there's going to be a village, sort of like a Habitat Village, a village demonstrating best practices. And the call for that is out. The call for the actual side events for the week-long stakeholder forum is not yet out, because that's being organized in terms of how to make it a little, it'll be like a World Urban Forum, but it'll be different, because the aspiration is to not have some siloed groups meeting, but to get to have interaction among the different groups that make up all the supporters for the activities around sustainable urban development. So that all is being thought out, and that if you just monitor the Habitat 3 website, you'll be able to see that. And then next, I have a huge platform.
I do want to answer the question about student involvement as well. We've mentioned the World Urban Forum a few times. That the World Urban Forum is put on by UN Habitat as kind of a global conference on urban issues and housing, urban development, what have you, every 2 years. And Habitat 3 could sort of be described as like a World Urban Forum on steroids. So this is, double at least the number of people and activities and events and the like. And I attended the last World Urban Forum, the one in Medellin that Tom mentioned, as a graduate student, in fact, at Columbia University. And definitely took advantage of, my school had some small amount of funding available to attend conferences. This is, in fact, a conference. So that is definitely one, if you're a student and you want to get yourself to Quito, that is one avenue to look into. It is also worth noting, this is a little different from your typical conference. APA, if you register and pay the fee, you can get a badge and come on in. The UN conferences are a little different. And if you're interested in being inside the official, action, as it were, the plenary sessions where there will be heads of state and ministers and all of that pomp and circumstance, you actually need a special accreditation. And represent an organization like an NGO or a university that already does UN advocacy, you probably already have that accreditation. On the other hand, not necessarily, but if you represent some group that's already involved with the UN, you're a little bit on top of this stuff. If you're a student coming from a university that maybe has never been involved, you might need to do a little bit of homework on behalf of your institution should you want to get such accreditation, because the deadline to apply for what they're calling special accreditation that would give you permission as a institutional permission, not individual, to attend Habitat 3 in an official capacity where you'll be a delegate, and apologize for all the jargon, but that's just how it goes. You'll be a delegate, you'll have the badge that can let you go past the security cordon and be in the room for all of those exciting speeches. That deadline is May 2nd. And that's fast approaching, and it's a little more complicated than just name, rank, and serial number. They do want to see some information about your institution, what you do with regards to housing and urban development. So the Habitat 3 website, and of course Cityscope, which I'll have to plug endlessly, is a great source to get a digest of information about what those deadlines are, how they operate, what you need to put together.
And just to remind folks and reiterate that Next City has the opportunity actually to engage conversations. We're always looking for your expert opinion. On our website, nextcity.org, you'll see a button that says Pitch a Story. If you're interested, we're welcoming op-eds. We want to get the message out. In particular, to Greg's point about Agenda 21 and the issues there, we need to define the new urban agenda before it defines us. We need to define it before other folks define it for us. We can't allow people to go out and start saying what they think it's all about. We need to remind folks that we are a special interest ourselves, that we need to take care of ourselves, we need to plan for the future. And in particular, to the millennials and younger people, I say, you need to be engaged. Many of our readers are under 40, and we're hearing more from each of you folks. You think differently than the baby boomers and others as we're going forward. We need to start raising your voice and go through. As voters, you are the folks who are going to make the difference. And frankly, because the baby boomer generation and beyond have put you in so much debt that we're in hock up to our ears, it's about time you started saying why and how you want that money spent. So if you're not happy with the way things are going, you need to speak up. And in particular, we provide the opportunity for you to write op-eds or to be engaged. And we will have the world stage in Surabaya, and we will have in Quito rather, and we'll have a place in Surabaya. We encourage you, if you are interested, to contact us. My cards are up here. Speak with me afterwards. Let's find and collaborate.
Yeah, please.
First of all, I commend you all for sorting through all the acronyms and the jargon and bureaucracy and keeping tabs on these important issues. I appreciate that. So directly, my question was actually directly to your last comment there. Is the name New Urban Agenda set in stone, or is there any, okay. They could not have picked a more tone-deaf name as someone who sat through a lot of the anti-Agenda 21 conspiracy theory and watched that submarine a lot of really good planning efforts, particularly in more rural areas of my state, Michigan. So I guess if that's set in stone, it's too late. I was going to ask if there was any discussion of a less conspiracy theory sort of name, but it'd be nice to think about, you know, ways to communicate, you know, in advance, I guess. I think that word agenda has been somewhat ruined, unfortunately.
On the highly touted Road to Habitat 3 website that I mentioned earlier, and that Greg put up right there, there is talking point guidance on exactly that topic, because we anticipated that this was going to come up. So as APA wanted to make sure that we communicated how to talk about the new urban agenda in a positive way so that we can get ahead of the curve on it. So take a look at that and then let us know how it works at the local level.
I'm also going to take advantage of this bully pulpit rather, and specifically request Luke that we chat a bit afterwards. So I don't want to speak too soon, but I've been in discussions with the editors at Planning Magazine, and we're talking about doing a few stories on Habitat 3, including a little bit of a toolkit or talking points, giving folks a heads up, sort of PSA style, that this could be coming up on the docket. So I would like to chat afterwards about your experience. So you cannot possibly have understood crystal clear every bit of information that we threw at you. So I am going to have to cajole the audience here to come up with a few more questions for our panel. We have a winner.
Hi, I'm Sean Tappy. I'm a graduate planning student at the University of Kansas. You all emphasized that the urban agenda is going to be a set of guidelines for the nation states, but also that, you know, there are going to be national applications with local interpretations, and I wanted to know what the process will be for making those applications applicable to the local level. Is APA, the policy division of APA, looking to take those national developments or those national interpretations and boil them for a set of more municipal or even state guidelines to be utilized, and is that going to be a global interpretation ideal, or is that going to be kind of left open to an individual state to deal with? Basically, how are we going to pool those down to be applicable to the actual local municipalities and other, you know, NGOs or non-governing bodies that work with, you know, the planning processes?
There are many answers to this question, and I want to take a broad one right now and respond to what Trudy was saying, and lamenting the fact that there's little national committee activity in her government. There was no national activity in our government with regard to the World Urban Forums and so forth until one unit of HUD decided to convene the people who went to these meetings prior to going to those meetings and get a master list of who was doing what, and then afterwards have a debrief. And that started with the Rio meeting in 2009. And over the years, this created a body of civil society people who pressured the government. And let me tell you, after the Medellin meeting, we got some State Department people there, and this was just before the Goal 11 was being looked at, and that's of the SDGs. And we basically talked about it, how important it was, and so on and so forth. But we also took the opportunity to ask them how they were treating Goal 11. As you may or may not know, the U.S. government did not support it. And so,
Nor did the UK government.
yeah, the UK and some others. But at any rate, so we did ask these young State Department people, they were young because they didn't send major figures there, exactly how they were approaching this particular problem of thinking about what the SDGs should be. And they proudly said they had 11 subcommittees of groups from the national government, different agencies, which were advising them on this. And so we said, oh, that's wonderful. Do you have one on cities? And they kind of looked at their feet and said, no, we don't. And then we said, well, where is cities? How are you dealing with this? And they kind of blushed and they said, well, we put it with oceans. Even they were embarrassed. At any rate, that kind of meeting pushed HUD to push the State Department to say, let us take over and help you with the testimony for this Goal 11. So this created an environment where civil society was quite pressuring. We had an opening here, and it came because of the sympathetic bureaucrat, but we had an opening to push. So now there's still this push. I wouldn't say the National Committee Well, the National Committee has been fairly powerful, setting up an agenda of activities to be done, and all of a sudden, they're looking to the National Committee to help advise on these things. This is not the delegation that will go to Habitat 3, but just civil society saying, you know, holding the feet to the fire. So it's really important from in the largest sense to keep holding the officials' the feet to the fire. And then let's get to what the professional organizations might do.
Yeah, well, AP is well positioned because we've had this, as I mentioned, the sustaining places discussions. We've had the partnerships post-Katrina with the Dutch dialogues to develop water management plans and a whole host of things that are going to be embedded in this question of how do you take these broader issues. And we hope, as Jeannie said, that the New Urban Agenda will be succinct and at a kind of a top level, and then that the SDGs, which is really all about how to do the localization of these issues, and the fact that in the policy documents that we have for the first time recognized that there are subnational responsibilities for urbanization, miraculously. That's going to help us with our position that keeping this at the top level and recognize parsing out that issue of which government levels are most suitable to the issue at hand is going to come out of the New Urban Agenda, so that I think that from a standpoint of research, communication, public policy, all that we have done fit right into that framework. So I think we're very well prepared to advise and work with our members to help implement that.
And in hearing part of Sean's question, which is the issue of leadership in particular in governments and cities, I'd encourage you to keep an eye on some of the organizations that represent governments, UCLG, others, 100 Resilient Cities, C40, and then the sleeper that I think you ought to look at is the Global Parliament of Mayors. They're going to be meeting in September, and this is an organization that's led by Ben Ball, who wrote the book If Mayors Rule the World. And his idea that's starting to come to fruition is if you had a couple of mayors who actually agreed to certain principles and started acting on those principles together, you might have a change. So by way of example, the mayor of Jersey City has decided to institute a policy that he wants to advance better gun control efforts. And so he has enacted a program where basically the city will not be procuring any additional firearms, et cetera, except through corporations, gun companies that are willing to adopt certain principles. You could imagine if 100 cities around the country, around the world, those kinds of principles. What about security? What about water use? What about energy? Start thinking about how mayors could use the free market system, capitalism, going back to that Agenda 21 thing, saying, actually, we're going to find ways to actually determine, we're going to use the free market system to achieve the world we want to see. So keep the Global Parliament Mayors on your agenda, and then think also a bit about how you can deal with this. I used to work for Governor Christie Whitman, and she at one point said, if all politics is local, paraphrasing Tip O'Neill, all policy is personal. You need to personalize all of this. Why does the New Urban Agenda matter to you? And Next City will be writing about personal stories. We encourage you to tell your personal stories, because at some point, the mayors and others, in particular global heads, can't ignore that. The last point I wanted to make was what came out of COP21 that was most striking to me was not only the mayors that participated, but also the corporations. And I would encourage APA and others to start working with corporations and the chambers and others to find ways to actually use the free market to say the New Urban Agenda matters. And then when you have an Elon Musk standing up saying, we need a carbon tax, that makes a difference. When you had of Unilever saying, we are actually going to be carbon neutral by 2020, let alone 2050, that matters. Corporations are leading the curve. Congress is a lagging indicator. You folks need to start telling the story and making sure the New Urban Agenda matters.
We're right up against 5:30, so I actually give the last word to Paul Farmer.
I want to take it back a little bit because I'd like people to kind of understand, I think, how far we've come with this worldwide discussion. When Anna Tibaijuka, Juan Close's predecessor as executive director of Habitat, came up with the idea of the World Urban Forum. The first World Urban one in 2001 was one where basically planning was seen and treated in the discussions as the whipping boy. All of the world's ills, whether the global south or global north, could be blamed on planning. And from business to those in government, that was the discussion. That led several of the nation's planning organizations to start having a conversation about how we could possibly change that conversation. In Denver in '03, Peter Oberlander from Canada, who had attended that very first Habitat, kind of started that conversation. And we in Halifax with CIP's conference, and I believe Cardiff, that year, Trudy, was where the RDPI conference was. And so in '04, Dave Siegel, representing APA, for example, was in Barcelona at the World Urban Forum too, where the conversation sort of was not much better. So we had set out to try to get World Urban Forum 3 to be in Vancouver in '06, and we were successful in doing that. We wanted it to be on the site where 30 years earlier Habitat 1 had been held. And I think that was when we really started seeing a real change in the conversation about planning. Cliff Hague of RDPI was the principal author of an effort to create the new urban planning, and ultimately 35 planning organizations around the world signed on to that at that event. I think it's fair to say that the last several World Urban Forums, the conversation has been much about what planning can do, as long as it is in fact a new urban planning. And I think it's been very effective. And in addition, in '09 to HUD, in '06, HUD was in Vancouver. The secretary then of HUD presented what I consider to be an embarrassing lecture to the world, telling the rest of the world that if they only valued ownership like we did, and it was the ownership society, and it was a very, very U.S.-centric view of what was needed around the world, and that was '06. Of course, in '07 and '08, some things were a little bit different. But the agenda has, I think, come a long way in that conversation, and I would certainly encourage anybody who has an interest to try to be in Quito. We had before the one in Xinjiang, we were in Xinjiang as planners before the Nanjing World Urban Forum, and that was one where the Global Planners Network, with funds from APA, RTPI, CIP, and PIA, those were the four partners, brought together about 200 planners from around the world before the World Urban Forum, 17 kilometers away in Xinjiang. And Anati Baijuga came to the event of the planners, even though her event was just starting the next week. And so I think we need to kind of make sure that planning continues to be seen as a key player in solutions, and not let it slip back to where it was, a dozen years or so ago.
Thank you. I don't believe there's another session afterward. So if you do have further questions, you're welcome to come up to our panelists. But in the interest of time and as a courtesy to everybody, we will formally close. So please, round of applause for our panel.